Today I'm going to talk about another series of poems. This one is called Qian Chu Sai, and it's a series of 9 poems. And I'm going to choose 4 of them to talk about in more detail. And this series, I will show you what these poems look like. This is the first one I'm going to talk about, the third in the series. These are at first glance, they look like Lü Shi poems, that is regulated verse, but they are in fact not. These are all poems in the so-called Yuefu style, that is a sort of folk song, literary folk song style, which was very popular in the Tang Dynasty and which was a form that had been cultivated all the way back from the Han Dynasty, really, and also one of the more, let's say, primordial forms of poetry that later led to the development of the regulated verse format. And there are plenty of poets in the Tang Dynasty who specialized in this type of poetry. Li Bai is one of them, who had a lot of Yuefu poems in his catalogue, but they are rare in Du Fu's collection. This title here, Qian Chu Sai, Chu Sai is actually the title. So Chu Sai, that means going out the passes, exiting the passes. That is said to have been an old Han Dynasty melody in the barbarian style, that is imported from the northern or the western regions, and therefore it's suited for military themes. And these are supposed to have been sung originally. I don't know if they were still sung in Du Fu's days or if they had forgotten the melodies, but they are folk song-like, and they are folk song-like in their diction and their feeling as well. And Du Fu, he's a master, as we all know, of poetic form, so he uses them in a very effective way. And the reason it's called Qian Chu Sai is, Owen translates it here, it has first series, it's just because there's another bunch later in Du Fu's collection with some more poems of the same name. But this is the first series. As I said, this is this melody, Chu Sai, was believed to be suited for military themes, and it is also a military theme in these 9 poems. They sort of tell a little story, or they're sort of little exposés of the life of a recruit, of a common recruit, on the many wars of the Tang Dynasty in their various border regions. This means that this whole series is most likely written before the Anlushan Rebellion and the whole chaotic period that came later, although there is some controversy about this in the scholarly literature. But I think that is probably the truth, because they all seem to be about frontier matters, and there's there are no references to Anlushan, and there are really only a very vague hint of any fighting going on in the inner of China. So this seems to be a pre-war poem. And the difference between this form and the Lü Shi form, there are many differences. So one of them is that the rhyme syllables can be in any tone, which they are here in the 3rd tone. Well, 3rd tone in modern Mandarin doesn't tell you much, especially about the pronunciation back then. But anyway, and also there aren't any strict rules for parallelism in any of the couplets, even though there are, of course. Du Fu makes use of parallelism here and there, but in general it's a freer form than the regulated verse, and therefore it gives a more simplistic and straightforward impression on the reader. So let's look here at the first one. I choose the third one to talk about, and the first ones are sort of that he sets off on his journey as a new recruit, and now he has already come quite far on his journey. So let's look at how far he has come. I will read the poem for you. 磨刀呜夜水，水赤刃伤手。玉清长断声，心绪乱已久。丈夫逝许国，愤惋复何有？功名图其陵，战鼓当速朽。I chose this poem because it actually, the first 4 lines, they are the most marvelous transformation actually of an earlier poem, an old poem also in folk song style, this UFO style, from the Jin dynasty, and this poem is called 陇头歌词, sort of the ballad of 陇头. 陇头 and yeah, okay, so that poem, it goes like this. It's just 4 lines. 陇头流水，乌声幽夜，遥望晴川，肝肠断绝。The flowing waters of 陇头, their sobbing sound, their sobbing sounds, it sounds sobs sorrowfully, something like that. I am looking at afar on the plains of Qing, and my inners, my heart, and they say Ganchang, which is sort of the heart region, the place of the feelings, is broken. So it's a very simple sentiment, and this 呜夜水 here in Du Fu, it comes directly from these sobbing waters, and that's why Owen translates here those sobbing waters. Well, that's the sobbing waters we all know from the poem 陇头歌词. This 陇头水, I haven't been able to find if that is a certain river or just some river in the whole, is this Long region, being sort of the first major mountain chain on the way west from Chang'an. But perhaps, I think most of these poems give you the feeling that they're going after the Tibetans or so. So this is, they're on the way west from Chang'an speaking. He's sharpening my sword in those sobbing waters. 磨刀呜夜水, and 水赤刃伤手. The water turned red. The blade cut my hand. Yes, exactly. 玉清长断声. Here it comes again. You know, 长断声also comes from the earlier poem 肝肠断绝. The sound of the flowing river makes him, remember his regrets of leaving his family behind, and his old life in his home, and this 玉清 I wanted to ignore, yes, to take lightly, literally, but the heart's thoughts have long been in turmoil. 心绪乱已久. The language here is, of course, quite simple, but when you see the earlier poem and you see how nicely Du Fu just transforms it into a sort of a little bit more elevated picture, it's really quite marvelous. Then he goes on, 丈夫是许国. 丈夫, yeah, a true man, like a man like himself then probably, like the recruit. 是许国, oath. 是. He has by oath given himself to his country. Yes, to devote his life to the realm, yeah. And 愤惋复何有. 愤惋 is translated here anguish or rage, or well, probably then anguish, 惋, rage, 愤, or 愤 frustration and 惋 regret. 愤怒和惋惜. Frustration and regret, presumably then for leaving his home and so on, because these are the themes that come up in the first two poems. 功名图麒麟，战果当速朽. This is also quite marvelous. 功名, deeds of fame, are painted in the royal gallery. 图麒麟, qilin refers to the Qilin Ge, which is a palace hall, or was a palace hall during the Han Dynasty. And in this palace hall, prominent servants of the state were painted with portraits. So he has ambitions to have his portrait painted there for his deeds to the state. And 战鼓当速朽. This is also just a wonderful, I think the translation here is a little bit humdrum. And the bones left from battle crumbled swiftly. It's more like, my bones should be rotten soon enough. 当 战鼓, the bones of battle, 当 should rot swiftly. It's he's prepared to let his mortal remains, disappear and disintegrate. That's not a problem for a soldier, as long as the memory of his fame is painted in the royal gallery, in the unicorn hall, as we might translate it more literally. So this is also just a wonderful couplet, I think. 功名图麒麟，战鼓当速朽. My bones should crumble soon enough. Okay, so that's the first one I wanted to talk about here. The third one, I skip over the fourth one and I go to the fifth instead. I'll read the poem again. 迢迢万余里，领我赴三军。军中亦苦乐，主将宁静闻。隔河见胡骑，疏忽数百群。我使为奴仆，几十数功勋。In this one, he starts introducing a theme that comes back also in another, the last one I will be talking about, poem 9, which is about corruption in the military. And it's introduced here in a sort of discreet, read between the lines way, but taken by together, all of these poems can actually be said to also be quite in the protest vein, although I must say it's a much more kind of discreet and actually more poetically effective form of protest poetry, I think, than the more famous ones like this Li Renxing, which the Ballad of the Fair Lady, which I've talked about in another video, in which I don't like very much. But I think these poems are really quite nice, and they're full of these really quite catchy and well formulated phrases. Let's look at the language here. 迢迢万余里. 迢迢is just far, basically the way something looks when it's far. Into the distance, more than 10,000 miles. 领我赴三军, we were led to reach the great grand army. So 三军, this actually, yes, it just means the armed forces, so the translation here is absolutely correct. But the word Sanjun, it goes back to an ancient sort of tripartite division of the army. 军中亦苦乐. Hardship and joys are different in the army. That is, they aren't evenly distributed in the army, but 主将, the commander, 宁静闻, Ning Jingwen. Sorry, Ning Jingwen. Ning here is a question word. How, more or less. He doesn't hear all. Jingwen, he doesn't hear completely. Yeah, the commander doesn't really care about this. So here you might, it sounds like, yeah, well, some suffer, some are happy in the army, and the commander can surely not hear all of it. Well, we should know here the historical background for this, because this is a very polite sort of sideways, modest innuendo about something that was endemic, really, to the Tang Dynasty military forces, and which really led to its downfall, because as we know, the Tang Dynasty was severely destabilized by problems that occurred within the military structure, and this is what is about to happen at this historical stage. And Du Fu, he was really aware of this even before it had happened. The thing here is that this refers to, of course, on a more general plane, to the fact that, in China, as in all martial cultures, there was the expectation that a worthy commander shared the hardships of the soldiers and the joys, such as they were. So this is an indication of corruption, and it is similar things like this are somewhat it's a somewhat frequent complaint in war poetry of the period, and he goes on here to actually tell us that he has become a slave. So what does this mean? Let's look at the next few lines. 隔河见虎骑 beyond the river, so Hu cavalry. Look at it, Hu, as if this was a certain tribe. I think this is just a mistranslation, and of course I know that Stephen Owen uses this as a matter of policy, because he doesn't want to use a word like barbarians, but Hu here, it's if they're going to meet the Tibetans, for example, this is the Tibetans. If they're going to meet the Xiongnu, of course the Xiongnu didn't exist back in the Tang Dynasty, Hu means the Xiongnu, so it's capitalizing it like this as if it was like a people. I think it's just wrong. Here it might be the Tibetans, for example, because in an earlier poem in the same series, the He, it could refer to the Jiaohe, which was sort of a fortress in the modern Xinjiang region, and that is mentioned in an earlier poem in the series, as I said. So He here could refer to this, and if they're in Jiaohe, they're probably going out to meet the Tibetans, which was the number one military threat in the West, which they always had to keep their eyes on. So Hu is probably the Tibetans here, and not some like ethnic group called Hu that doesn't exist. So Shu Hu Shu Baiqian, suddenly they just appear. Shu Hu, which means very fast, in an instant, in a very short time, many barbarians or Tibetans. And then he says, 我是为奴仆. For the first time now, I've become a slave. Yes, 奴仆 indeed means slave. And here, this is what I was talking about up here. There are records from this time of, common soldiers actually being used like the servants and slaves of the commanders. And this was seen as an abuse of power by contemporary observers, and it even incurred imperial displeasure, and also all the tales of luxury of the generals and so forth. So this is really, he really refers here, with using simple words and kind of roundabout diction, to something that was probably well known at the time. And this is also something that this folk style music usually, folk style poetry tried to imitate sort of what the concerns and complaints of normal people could be. And of course the normal complaints of normal people couldn't be voiced in a straightforward and sort of heroic manner back in the days, so he used this sort of innuendos and suggestions. So this is suggestive. 几是树功勋. Shu here, a verb, accomplish, like literally plant in the ground, like you plant a deed in the ground. We've seen his hope of the unicorn gallery here, and this refers to it, but now he starts to despair about it, because you can really imagine, of course, the demoralizing effect of corruption in the army leadership, and powerful enemies at the same time. So they did hold out, for the moment, but revolt was not far away. So Du Fu here, if this is written before the Andalusian Rebellion, we can certainly take all of this as quite prescient of what was coming. Let's go to the seventh one. No, sorry, the sixth one. This is really the first, the one in the whole series that I think is the most folk song-like, so that's why I choose this one. 挽弓当挽强，用箭当用长，射人先射马，擒寇先擒王，杀人亦有限，列国自有疆，苟能制亲邻，岂在多杀伤。 I mean, as you hear, could never be a 律诗, a regulated verse, like having these repeated verbs occurring at the same place in several sentences like this. It's just incompatible with 律诗 poetics or form, but it is perfectly folk song-like. It's very, very folk song-like. You can just imagine them almost singing this as their march. It's really simple and direct. What does it mean then? 挽弓, pull the bow. Yes, pull the bow. You should use a strong one. 挽弓当挽强的弓。用箭应该用长的箭。Why should you use long arrows? Are they better? I don't know. This is a question I should like to know the answer for. Probably someone knows. It probably has a simple answer. Anyway, so this is sort of the accumulated wisdom after many long years in the army, perhaps, of this recruit. To shoot a man, first shoot the horse. To capture the foe, first capture their chief. Useful tips. Well, this is kind of funny, actually, because it's supposed to reflect the sort of tactical thinking of the common soldier, as Du Fu sees it. And then he goes on, and Du Fu gets off this rhythm. 杀人亦有限，列国自有疆。县, 疆 mean basically the same things, of course. There's a limit to killing men. There are borders to be observed between countries. Presumably, I mean, he means some kind of natural limit to killing men, and some kind of natural limits between countries. What would those be? Well, you can meditate over that for yourself. But he says here, we need to stop the raiding of the barbarians, basically. 苟能制亲邻, if we can stop their raiding, then we have demarcated our borders, and that would be enough. The idea here is probably that the point of warfare isn't to expand the empire infinitely. I think all of this actually, it sounds, I'm afraid, more like the musings of Du Fu than the sort of thinking of a soldier necessarily. But probably he means, like a good Confucian, that there's a sort of virtuous way to both go to war and to stop wars. And that would presumably mean, not going on the offensive in faraway lands, for example. But still, who knows? I mean, the whole thing also says, use intelligence to win, right? Go for if you shoot the horse when a man is riding, he's going to be on the ground and easy to kill. Kill the chief, and the barbarians will scatter. So it's also sort of tactical ideas, and like go after them with intelligence, because that's who the imperial Chinese are, and we're not interested in just killing. 其在多杀伤. It does not depend on much killing. We just want to control them and make sure that they're not a nuisance for us. But yeah, whatever spin we put on this, I think it's quite doubtless that it's generally critical of these expansionist wars that were going on in the Tang Dynasty, and also the waste of human lives, which of course is nice. It's a good thing to, and worthy thing to criticize. Let's go on. The last one I want to talk about is the last one in the series, the 9th. 从军10年余，能无分寸功。众人贵苟得，欲与修雷同。中原有斗争，况在敌与戎。丈夫四方志，安可辞故桥。Yes, he has been with the army for more than 10 years now, so this is the end of the journey. Or perhaps it's not the end of his journey, but it's the end of our journey with him, and the end of the portrait that Du Fu makes of this man. And he's been in the army for 10 years. The first poem was when he just set out on his journey. So now this is the sort of summary of his experience. This sentence here, 能无分寸功, this is really a question mark after here. So this is a question. Is it possible for me after 10 years not to have done not even a little bit of martial deeds? 分寸, a gram and a millimeter, we would say now, perhaps. Like gram, an ounce and an inch, an ounce and an inch of deeds. Is it possible for me not to even have done an ounce and an inch of deeds? Of course not, because I've been in the army for so long. So this is a question. 众人贵苟得，欲与修雷同. I mean, this is a whole. This also relates back to the whole idea of corruption in the army, and I think it's such a 含蓄, such a humble and indirect and almost blushing little indication of that Du Fu is entirely clear of what's going on in the army and the problem with sort of empire at this point in history. What does this mean? Let's look at it in detail. 众人, all the others, most men, he says, yes, of course, they prize, see as noble or put value on 苟得. What does 苟得 mean? Any chance for advantage? Owen says, yet, I mean, if we don't want to be super literal about it, it's basically things that you have gotten, 得, by accident, 苟得, gotten by accident, without any merit of their own. True honor, on the other hand, would come by distinguishing oneself in acts of valor, And, as I said, the interesting thing is that there are so many historical records of commanders behaving like shit, and also, besides this corruption, like using soldiers as slaves and such, there's also stories of these commanders who would claim credit for victories and stuff, which in fact had not been accomplished. So it seems like managing this whole empire at this point was a really difficult business, and there was plenty of room for sneaky shit to happen. And here the recruit has sort of become aware of all of this, and it's definitely the case that he's not just, when he says 众人, he's not just speaking of his fellow soldiers, but also of generals and others. And he said, 欲与修雷同. I might speak, that is, he might speak of all the things that he would have done. Like, I want to say something, I want to tell them of what I have done, but I don't want to, I feel ashamed to be the same as them. 雷同. What does 雷同 mean? This is a quite common sort of locution in the Chinese language. Be the same as something else, be identical to something. 雷同. But why does it say that? I've never thought about this before, so I had to look it up. Actually, the first explanation that we have for this word, 雷同, it comes from Zheng Xuan in his commentary on the Li Ji, and he says, when thunder strikes, it echoes from everything at once. Aha. That's interesting, isn't it? But that is not what a man's word should be like. A man's word should come from himself. This is what it says in the commentary to the Li Ji. Here, of course, it just means say the same things. I don't want to say the same things as other people, because then people think I'm as insincere as they are, even though I've really accomplished something. He doesn't want to be confused with people who take credit for others' accomplishments, so he shuts up about his own. In my excellent edition of Du Fu's works, there's actually quite a lot of interesting information comprised in the commentary to this poem, and it just shows examples of like how all this golde stuff, this ill-gotten advantages that were actually achieved in these border areas at that time. And I thought I would just summarize this for you, because I think it's quite interesting. There are a few interesting stories. So one story was about Shi Siming. So as you may know, the Anlu Shan rebellion is called in Chinese An Shi Zhiluan. An is Anlu Shan, the first big general who proclaimed himself emperor. The next one who proclaimed himself emperor after Anlu Shan was called Shi Siming. And his first claim to fame, it says in my commentary, was a piece of treachery, that involved a Tang military official. So Shi Siming, he ended up in the Xi tribe at one point, which is sort of a Mongolic people on the northern border. And when he was there, he tricked them to dispatch a diplomatic force to the Tang emperor. And then he told a Tang commander that this Xi tribe was coming for them, and then the Xi tribe were trapped and were buried alive. And the point here is that this becomes gung, this kind of gung, it becomes a military deed result for the involved, and presumably the general who did this, he became promoted for it, and Shi Siming actually it was his first step into the imperial army and the bureaucracy. But so this was a gung, it was a military deed for the people involved, but this kind of treachery, of course, was entirely destructive of foreign relations. Another story, it concerns Cui Xiyi, who was a general that was stationed on the front against the Tibetans. And at this point there was a peace treaty in force between the Chinese and the Tibetans. But one of this general's subordinates, he faked an imperial order to attack. And he did this in order to bolster his own position in the army. And then the Tang army, they won, of course, having surprised them in the middle of the peace treaty. But they destroyed their good relations with the Tibetans. So this is another example of this kind of stupid shit that went on just for people who wanted military honor for themselves. We also have the Nanzhao Kingdom, which is in modern Yunnan, and that was created by a local chieftain called Piluge, and he managed to defeat and unite 6 different warring tribes in this area. And to do that, he bribed a Tang commander to lend his forces to his cause. So that there was a Tang commander there who really sort of, for his own good, lent advantage to a person who later became a huge problem to the Tang Empire, of course, because later this united Nanzhao Kingdom, after all these 6 tribes had been united, that would become a major problem for Tang's southern border. And the wars in the Nanzhao region also costed hundreds of thousands of men. So that's like 3 examples of these stupid things. And there's also outright treachery that was used as a means of expanding the empire's borders. For example, Gao Xianzhi, the half Korean general that I talked about in another poem. There was a poem about his horse, which I talked about also in this series. Gao Xianzhi, he also did he did this. He used treachery when he wanted to conquer what is now Tashkent in Uzbekistan, which was back then was called Chash. In Chinese, it was called Shiguo, that is stone country. That was a Turkic city-state at that time. And Gao Xianzhi, he made a peace treaty with them, or a peace agreement, and as soon as the enemy withdrew, he attacked. So that was also a way of, that was outright treachery, not according to the rules of engagement at all, and he plundered the city's wealth and diamonds and sapphires and so on. And another example of this kind of shit that went on in the border regions. Gao Xianzhi, of course, he was a Tang hero, so there's no question about that. And he was also a very creative guy in general. There's interesting stories about his military exploits in the region, and it's quite interesting in general to read about all the stuff that the Chinese were doing in the Central Asian region. Because remember, this was really the point in history when the Chinese reached the furthest west that they've ever been in a military sense, and they still haven't gotten further than they were back then. Gao Xianzhi, for example, when he was at one point responsible for a campaign for breaking up a sort of alliance of Tibetan-aligned states in the Kashmir region, what is now the Kashmir region, the Indian-Pakistan Kashmir region. And then at one point he had to cross the Hindu Kush mountains. And then his soldiers, when they had crossed the mountains, they were afraid to go down from the mountain, presumably because there was glaciers and everything, and they thought if we go down, we can probably not go back up again. And then Gao Xianzhi, he had to trick his army to go down. What did he do? He dressed up some men as locals, and he sent them ahead, and then they pretended to come against the Tang army and pretended that they were convoys, envoys from the local king, and welcomed them down the mountain and gave them assurances. The bridge to the Tibetans was destroyed, everything is nice and dandy, you can come down. And then they managed to conquer that kingdom and sort of defeat Tibetan influence in that area. So there's all kinds of funny things happening in this part of history as well. It's not all Goude, but Goude it sums up a lot of destructive and actually not just morally wrong, but also objectively destructive things that were going on at this point. The last 4 lines then of this poem. 中原有斗争，况在敌与戎。中原, it can reasonably only refer to the central plains of China, the inner regions of the Chinese Empire. So this raises a bit of a question mark. This fighting now in the heartland, well, does that mean that this is actually written during the An-Lushan Rebellion? Perhaps. I don't know. But it is strange that all the other poems in the series seem only to concern border stuff and not what's going on in the inner part of the country. Di Yurong, like there's fighting in the heartland, perhaps some kind of political fighting, maybe not military fighting, political fighting. How much more in the Di and Rong regions? Di being traditionally the northern barbarians and Rong being the western ones. Even there, how much more here? Kuang, how much more? 丈夫四方知，安可辞故穷. More fine vocabulary for us to chew. 丈夫, a true man's concerns are for all the world. I don't know if this is really the idea. 四方知, the will of a man for the 4 directions. I mean, 知 is the will, sort of the intentions of someone, and the intentions for the 4 directions. I don't know if that means a concern for all the world, but his intention to stand on the border regions and defend the empire, something more like that, I would think. We have all the problems, but 安可辞故穷, I'm not going to get anywhere, but I'm not going to give up either. So what does this mean, word by word? 安可, how can I? And 辞故穷, refuse to 故穷. What does 故穷 mean? 故穷 comes directly from the 论语. That is the Analects of Confucius. And in the Analects of Confucius, it's used as an attribute of the 君子, the superior man. It basically means to, as it says, hold fast in hardship, not to change one's aspirations when in a difficult situation. Stabilize in poverty or hardship. Stabilize even more, that is, to hold fast to one's principles even when in hardship. You know, this soldier, he hasn't got any recognition or emoluments, which is not so very strange because he has given us so many hints of the corruption in the army. And so the whole thing, basically, this last poem, the number 9, it's sort of a dismissal of the lust for recognition, really, when in the service of the empire. So it seems he started out with ideas of wanting to have himself painted in the royal gallery and stuff, and now he realizes, this is just destructive. The fact that people just want to get attention and recognition leads them to commit all kinds of ill deeds, and I'm content with just defending the borders and standing fast in hardship. So that is all I'm going to talk about today, and I think these poems, they recommend themselves really by being quite unique in Du Fu's collection, for being UFO poems, but also for their general quality, of course, and the picture that he paints of, again, an empire really teetering on the brink of disaster because of a culture of corruption in the military and more generally in the sort of management layers of the empire. So that was it for today, and thank you for listening. Bye.